All right. Time to get started with our Sunday school class hour. I'd like to welcome those online to Bethany Missionary Baptist Church. This is our class time, of course, leading into our preaching time around 10:30. So I'll open it up. Do we have any prayer requests that need to be mentioned? No, we need to remember our youth and some adults that are going to, on a retreat to Wyoming here in about a week. Need to remember them. Christy Park's mom. Okay. All right. Any others that come to mind? All right. We always need to remember those who are. We've had some visitors lately. We need to remember them. Remember our church and our pastors and our country. So open us up in the word of prayer. Dear Lord God, thank you so much for your word, Lord. I just thank you for the hope and assurance we can find in studying your word. I pray that we have a hunger and a desire just to learn and to grow in your word, and that we just have a desire to serve you in the world that we live in. Lord, I know that things sometimes look dark, but we always need to refer back to what you promised in your word. I thank you for your Son and the hope that we find through that. Lord, forgive us where we fail you. In your name I pray. Amen. All right. Today we're in lesson number 6, and this is when Saul was chosen as king. You know, it's easy, when you study Saul, it's easy to study all the bad. You know, that's kind of where we always go with Saul. You study the things that Saul did wrong, study the things where Saul failed, but there were some things that Saul did right. There were some things that Saul did good. And keep in mind, Saul did not pick himself. That's another thing. You know, Saul didn't run for office. He didn't have signs. He wasn't beating the doors down, shaking hands. Saul was picked by Samuel, but he was not picked because he was God's chosen, but he was allowed by God to be put in that position. Always remember, Saul didn't put himself in that position. Although he was the people's choice by his looks, there again, Saul was put in that position. But how often are we guilty of thinking that we know best? That's one thing you'll see in the first of this lesson, is we think we know best. I mean, you hear it said, mother knows best, or father knows best. But so that we think we know best. After all, we're good Christian people, so why would we not know what's best? Well, today we'll look at what Israel thought was best, what they wanted and what they got. Now, oftentimes, what we want and what we get wind up not working out the way we really think they would in the long run. Who was God's choice for king? It was David. If you really study, he allowed Saul, but he chose David. And David was not an afterthought because Saul was a failure in some ways. David was in the plan all along. He didn't have to change, kind of like we always say, he didn't change the plan after Adam failed or sinned in the garden. David was the plan, and Christ's lineage was going to come through David, and that was already established. Sometimes I think we may get confused and think, well, Saul failed, so he had to go get David. No, David was always in the plan. But Saul was the first anointed by Samuel to be the leader, the single ruler of Israel as a king or a ruler. So we'll start off our reading 1 Samuel 9, 1-2. It says, Now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Amphath, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul. Boy, them big names. How'd they get Saul? All those other names you can't pronounce. And the son's name was Saul. A choice young man, a goodly. And there was not among them, the children of Israel, goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward he was higher than any other people. So you read this. Saul was not a bad guy. I mean, in the Bible it says what? He was goodly. The Bible doesn't say somebody's goodly that doesn't fit that mold. That's one thing. The Bible's always perfectly clear on its description. So what I read here is Saul was viewed as a goodly person. He was not viewed as a bad guy, a bad person. He was viewed in a positive light at his young age. Now, what tribe, though, was Christ coming from, the lineage of? Judah. What tribe was Saul from? Benjamin. So you see right there, the tribe of Benjamin was never set up to be the ruling or the most authoritative tribe. And it was always Judah. Judah was always the line, the picture of power. So we initially see a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, and says he was a mighty man of power. First we see that Saul come from a family of power in the tribe of Benjamin. He come from a family of probably some influence, probably some wealth. You know, look around the community. Most people selected in communities in positions of authority typically don't come from poverty. They come from financial wealth. They come from family power. Typically, we don't choose people based off of who they actually are. We choose many based off of their look and where they come from. You think about that. So, we often associate power and leadership. Sadly, our view of power and leadership go together. If someone comes from a powerful family, they must be a good leader, but oftentimes that's not the case. But we're bad to associate that because they come from a wealthy family, things like that. We assume someone with family power would be better than just the normal average person oftentimes. Notice in verse 2 it says Saul, the son's name was Saul, a choice young man, goodly, and he was tall. It says from his shoulders upward he was higher than any of the people. He stood out in the crowd. That's what that means. Not saying it's a bad thing. He was not tall as a curse, but he was just taller than most. So something pretty interesting, and I actually learned this in my job going through we were doing a class. 60% of all Fortune 500 CEOs are over 6 feet tall. That's a true statistic. In the United States, Fortune 500 CEOs, 60% are over 6 feet tall. But the common height of a male is 5'9". It's very normal for people to select someone in leadership that is slightly taller than the rest. That's just human nature. And even worldly statistics line up with that. But what did you see here? Saul was taller than the others. He stood out in the crowd. We associate power and leadership, whether we like to admit it or not, with height, so I'm out. But that's what we do. So even, there's always been that connection, though, with a certain look, with a certain amount of power and prestige and might. But, David broke all them molds. When you study about David, he kind of broke a lot of them molds. It doesn't say David was a lot taller or stood out in the crowd. And we know one that we know didn't stand out in the crowd was Christ. He blended in with the crowd. He was a normal man that really wasn't stood out. But Saul stood out in the crowd. Now let's look deeper. How do we classify people? We're basically guilty of choosing people based on those looks. We really are. I mean, if somebody comes in and they have a certain look, we associate certain things in our mind. You make what they call unconscious bias based off of someone when you see them. Now, it doesn't mean that you're stereotyping, but to an extent, we put people in buckets initially when we see them on first view. When someone walks in this place and we don't know them, they're tall, they're in a nice suit, their wife looks the part, their kids are all nicely. We assume they probably fairly influential, fairly well off. We assume that. Somebody comes in, and if they're, in an average vehicle, dressed just kind of normal, everything's kind of normal, we don't assume that they're coming from a powerful or wealthier family. We assume that when they walk in, we already have in our mind certain things about people. And that's not necessarily wrong, that's just human nature. But we need to always know that is not always who that person truly is. We need to be smart enough to know that that's an outward appearance. Although it can mean something, God looks inward, and we as people, we need to focus on not looking at that outward appearance. Now, this is not saying there's anything wrong with being tall, looking the part. Saul's family was one of, we thought, of probably decent status in this tribe of Benjamin. Nothing wrong with that. The point here is that people choose based on what they can see. People choose based on the eye appeal, or even sometimes someone can speak a really good message. Politicians do it every day, but we can't see the heart. We can try to look at actions, but people can fool us. We say, you can fool me, but you can't fool God. That's as true a statement as you can find. So we need to be careful when we're choosing people that we're not choosing based off of our desire and that eye appeal. God did not intend for Saul to be, he allowed Saul to be king, but he did not personally choose Saul as a blessing. Saul was chosen kind of as a you want it, you got it kind of a thing. I often wonder, you studying, did Saul is the people's choice, was it a little bit of punishment for their lack of following God? And I believe it was. Now, it does not mean that Saul did all bad, but Saul was not, God was not, he was putting that person in place to show them why, hey, that's not what you need, but that's what you want. Oftentimes the nation of Israel got punished by getting what they truly wanted when it wasn't what God truly had in store for them. But we're no different. Outward appearance is not that important. I'm not discounting the way someone dresses, but it's not the only thing that sets people apart. God knew before Saul was chosen that Saul would fail. God knew all that. God was not surprised when Saul, if you read on, when he didn't follow God in some of the ways that he went, when his heart turned from God, and it says God turned from Saul, and Saul knew it immediately when God turned from him. In churches, we've seen people selecting positions of influence often based on outward appearance or on social status. That's really sad when a church puts someone in a position that can affect the whole congregation. And I'm not talking pastoral, I'm talking about positions on committees and things like that. But we select people and we don't truly look at the spiritual maturity, and oftentimes what we get is someone that lacks spiritual maturity making decisions that affect the whole church. We need to be careful how we choose people in positions. And I'm talking about from a security guard to a door greeter to a teacher, anything. You do not need to pick people based off of that look or that eye appeal or where they come from. You need to base it off of that spiritual maturity. And I'm not saying as a teacher that I was selected correctly. I'm just saying we need to be very discerning in people that we choose to do things within the church. Now the next verses is... it's in 1 Samuel. It's talking about Samuel when he anoints Saul. It says, "Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came, saying, Tomorrow about this time I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be captain over my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cry is come unto me. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said unto him, Behold, the man whom I spake to thee of, this same shall reign over my people. Then Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head, and kissed him, and said, Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? So before we completely dismiss Saul, keep in mind he was still allowed by God to be put in this position. He was even led by God to God's man. It was not just a random bumping into, where they bumped into one another. God set it apart to where that Saul and Samuel would meet, and that Samuel would know that's the guy. He was still to be respected. I believe that God does expect us to respect leaders, whether we choose them ourselves or not. We're still supposed to respect the leaders set before us, because keep in mind, whether you agree or disagree with the current regime, even in our country, God allowed them to be put in that position. It might not have been for our blessing. It might have been for our awakening and punishment regardless, or it might be a blessing. But God has allowed them to be there, and His people, we should be humble enough to respect and pray for them. Not agree, not give in, but respect. I think we can see in verse 16 that God used Saul. Anoint him to be captain over my people in Israel, that he may save my people. That's God's words to Samuel, saying that he may save my people. So was it all bad? God had a plan for Saul and his reign over Israel. And the plan was to save the people from the Philistines. God allowed Saul to be used in a mighty way in some ways. We focus on all the bad qualities, but still you see God did use Saul. God was with Saul, or he would not have departed from Saul. When he talks about when he realized that God had departed, that means God had to be with him at one point. Did Samuel know exactly who God was selecting? No, but God led Samuel and Saul to have a divine intervention meeting where they run into one another, and Samuel knew that's the guy. Saul was set on a path to meet God's man, Samuel. Now, that makes me wonder, how many times has God set us on a path to meet someone, and we wasn't attentive to what Samuel listened to God. He told him, hey, look for this, and you're going to be here, and he's going to be there. How many times has somebody been set on our path, and we weren't attentive enough to God to listen and hear and make that connection? It might have been just as simple as someone needing to hear from a person about the Lord. Is God still doing that today? I believe God still sets our paths to run into people, but oftentimes we're not sensitive to the Lord and His Spirit, so therefore when those divine intervention meetings bump, we don't realize it. One interesting point in verse 16 was God told Samuel he would anoint him captain. Now, what do you think that purpose is? Does he say, does captain and king carry the same weight? They don't. Captain is from a military standpoint, but he's talking here about him saving him from the Philistines. So that's more of a military conquest. At this time, the Philistines were putting a pretty good whooping on the Israelites on a regular basis because the Israelites were not following the Lord. The Israelites don't even have to fight their battles when they were sticking close to the Lord. They were losing because they were not following the Lord in the first place. Although Saul was not God's choice to be the long-term king, Saul would still be used to save Israel from the Philistines. We all just see that, we all, just as Saul, have free will choice, though. Saul did not have to fall away from God. He made those choices. Now, did God know he was going to make them? Yeah, God knew. But it's just like with us. God knows the choices we're going to make before we make them. But we still have the free will choice to make those decisions. It's never that anyone was set in place to be over people that can't be a godly leader. It's that we make decisions and choices whether we're a godly leader or not. Saul could have been a godly leader to the day he drew his last breath, but his choices caused him to fall away. Do we pray for the leaders to have godly wisdom, to use His Word as their light, to stand on the 10 Commandments that are the basis for all moral law today? Or are we more likely to pray for our nation that He remove people from positions of authority and put someone else in? We need to remember, pray for the ones that are set before us and pray that those that do come along will be the right ones, but we need to pray for who is set before us in leadership. No one exemplified leadership like David, and no one exemplified praying and being respectful of leadership like David. David had every right, if you read on, to have killed Saul on 2 or 3 occasions because Saul was trying to kill him, but he would not do it because he respected God first enough to know that when God was ready for Saul to be removed, God would remove him. It was not going to be at David's hand. David showed respect for a leader that wasn't always following the godly ways, and we need to take that as an example. We still owe respect to the leaders that are set before us, and we need to pray for them earnestly that their heart be changed. Did Saul have potential? After all, Samuel as a spiritual leader was right there for him to lean on. So Saul had every opportunity to live a long life as a good godly leader because he had Samuel there beside him. What better way to know and to know what's right than to have someone like Samuel in your ear all the time? So Saul had everything in his path to be a godly man, but Saul turned from God. In verses 9-21, it's not in our quarterly, chapter 9, verse 21, it says, bear with me one second. It says, "And Saul answered and said, Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speakest thou to me?" Saul showed humility right there. That was when he was talking to Samuel. He showed humility. That's a quality. He didn't show boldness. He showed humility right then. Saul showed that, hey, I'm probably not the best choice. Why would you choose me, Samuel? I know often we only focus on the bad, but Saul did show qualities there. The next verses talks about Samuel, when he announces Saul as king, in 1 Samuel 10, 17 through 26. And it says, "And Samuel called the people together unto the Lord of Mizpeh, and said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of all the kingdoms, and out of them that oppressed you. And ye have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations. And ye have said unto him, Nay, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was taken. And he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, and the family of Matra was taken. And Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. And when they sought him, he could not be found. Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, if the man should yet come hither. And the Lord answered, Behold, he hath hid himself among the stuff. And they ran and fetched him thence. And when he stood among the people, he was higher than any of the people, from his shoulders and upward. And Samuel said to all the people, See ye whom the Lord hath chosen, and there is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. Then Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom, and wrote in the book, and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gilbeth, and there went with him a band of men whose hearts God had touched. So, if you had read much in the Old Testament, you often see that a prophet would start off speaking by reminding the people of where they come from. Oftentimes you see that they would be reminded that God brought them out of Egypt, always reflecting back on the blessings and the things that God had done for the people up to this point. They were constantly being reminded of the greatness of their God. God was the same before, after, and then. And, when they were slaves in Egypt and brought them out, it was always look back at where God has brought you to. Israel showed they lacked the respect and trust in God, though. If God could raise up a man like Moses and bring them out of the land of Egypt when they had there was no reason other than God's hand getting them out of Egypt, why would they not trust Him now to protect them from the Philistines? Israel was like we are. What have you done for me lately? It's kind of how we are. What have you done for me now? It's not what has God done for me up until this point. There's a song, count your many blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. Do we truly look back and count those blessings? Had Israel realistically looked at the nation they had become and where they had come from, they would have known it's in God's hand. We don't need a man unless God sends him, and we're good. We got God on our side. Samuel was plainly saying, look at the greatness of our God. Look at the things He's done for us in the past. It would often do us good to take a look at what the Lord has done for us. Maybe in our family. Maybe our family was in shambles. Maybe someone near us was not given a chance to live. Look back at the greatness that God has done. Look back at the great things He's done before we go to complaining about what's coming up. It's far easier to focus on what we think we should have today instead of looking back on what we got yesterday. But we fail to look at what we've already been given. The same God that brought you through yesterday will be the same God that will take you through tomorrow. The same God that parted the Red Sea for Israel was the same God that could have delivered them out of the Philistines' hands. Why were the Philistines even a problem? Disobedience when they come into the Promised Land. Had they done what God intended when they come into the Promised Land, the Philistines they wouldn't even been mentioned right here. They didn't follow God's plan in the beginning. They stopped short because God told them what to do. They stopped short on some of the military conquest. So now the Philistines were a thorn in their side. How many thorns are in our side now because we stopped short on something we should have done? Maybe it's personally, maybe it's in our family. How many times do you just feel it still in the small of your back? Had you done it right then, it wouldn't be there no more. How many times are we still facing and dealing with things because we didn't quite go all the way with what God intended? We almost did it, and we got really close, but we stopped just a little bit short. God may tell you to take, the good thing about our God, though, is even when we stop short, He doesn't. Even when we stop short, we may face consequences, but God doesn't just say, well, that's what you wanted, wash His hands and turn His back on us. If God says go right and we go left, He goes left with us, and He's still right there to help us, pull us back out of the ditch no matter what. Notice in verse 19, Samuel told it truthfully. He reminded Israel that they had rejected their God. This is not the most glamorous of introduction speeches. Here I'm about to be announced as king, and he's pretty much saying, hey, here's what you wanted. You rejected God. You turned your back on God, and here's His king. A little bit rough introduction speech. In verse 21, though, something strange happened. When he goes to introduce Saul, he couldn't be found. I would have thought that this speech bringing in Saul, he would have been preparing himself, but instead he was found hiding with the stuff. There's no great, I've done a little bit of looking and reading and trying to figure out the significance of that. There's a lot of opinions, don't really know. Some think that he was humble. Some think he was scared to death of the position he was about to accept. I think he was scared. Why else would he have went and hid? But think about it. He's fixing to take over a nation, an entire nation. He's fixing to be the ruler over an entire nation. Many of us like to think if I was given that position today in our country, I'd change some things. But think about it like this. If you really look at, he was fixing to be the ruler over an entire nation of people. That's bigger than I think we realize. When we think we would like to be president for a day, do we really grasp what that truly could mean and how many lives we could affect, good or bad? How would we be? Anytime you're put in a position over 1, 10, or 1,000,000, you should do some real soul searching. Are you truly ready to be in that position over a multitude or over one? It's easy to say, if I were the boss, here's what I would do, but that day you become the boss, sometimes it changes things a little bit. I'm sure if you ask Brother Jonathan, when he surrendered to preach, he had it in his mind how things were going to go in his churches where he was going to pastor. And now you probably ask him, he'd say, it ain't went like I thought it was going to go. Because you're over people. It should be very humbling. The problem is with many leaders, they don't accept the bottom line. They don't accept that if the nation fails, they're the failure. They want to accept that the glory when things go good, but guess what? As a leader, you got to accept failure when things go bad. I like to read military history about some of the great military leaders, and one of my favorite ones is General Eisenhower. One of the greatest military leaders the U.S. has ever seen was Eisenhower. If you read up, by far, I think he was probably the greatest military leader ever. And Eisenhower truly understood the position he was in, and he showed so much humility. He wrote a letter. In the last sentence, he put it in his pocket. I've read this account. When he was making the final say to go to D-Day, he said, if any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He took blame for thousands of lives, and thousands died. But he took full responsibility. He didn't even go. He stayed back on the dry land. That was his position. But when we take positions in leadership, we need to know if it fails, it's your fault. And we need to think about it like that. Because it's on you when you accept those positions. Eisenhower understood that. He's not in the Bible, but I believe he truly knew his position. And I believe if you study Eisenhower, he trusted God because in a lot of things he referred to, he prayed. He talked about praying for the people and praying for these victories. But we need to take things that serious when we're put in any position, whether it's over a group of 5 kids in a class or over millions. You need to accept that responsibility. Too many people want to accept the great things when it comes to responsibility, and I think most of our leaders, you see a lot of that now in our country. They want the great things, but they don't want the bad things that come along with it. They don't accept the true responsibility. Saul was being put in a position of great responsibility. And I think that's something he struggled with that, I think you see right there. I think that's why he went and hid. Here, we're talking about Eisenhower, the most powerful man in the world at the time, it's thought. Because, you think about presidents, things like that, but at this moment, he was the final say on that battle. But guess what? Saul, many times in his reign, they went to battle. And if they went to battle, it was on his back. It was on his decision. And people died. So, I think for all the bad Saul did, I think we got to look at some of the things that was on him. How would I have done when I was responsible for a whole nation? Probably wouldn't have made it near as far as Saul did. It's easy to talk about the bad things that Saul did, but when you put yourself in that position, think about your own life and how you operate. Saul may not have done as bad as I would have done. So I say all that to remind us, regardless if you've been elected over something simple or something great, we need to show humility. Saul actually showed some humility at times when he first anointed him. I think we need to take lessons. It's easy to focus on the bad, but there's a lot of good lessons you can learn from Saul. But you can also learn from his failures and how, had Saul had it to do over again, he probably would have done it differently. One thing I think we see as we study the life of Saul, we remember only the bad, but not the good. Saul had some good qualities. Saul's ultimate demise, though, was later when he turned from the Lord, and the Lord then turned from him. And Saul made those choices. God didn't set it up to where at some point he was going to turn from Saul. Saul turned from God, and then God turned from Saul. God doesn't turn from us. That's our choices that cause the turning of God from us. It was Saul's bad choices that led to his demise, but Saul didn't have to make them choices. So, appreciate everyone this morning.